Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking in Worship. My name is Dan Shields. I'm a worship pastor here at Orchard Hill Church.
My name is Chris Jamison. I'm a worship leader here at Orchard Hill Church as well, and...
My name is David Bowens, and I am also a worship leader here at Orchard Hill Church.
And this Walking in Worship podcast is designed just to help all of us grow in our faith and understanding of what worship really is. Well, this has been an interesting chapter for me to read through. We're in chapter 3, starting on page 25, and Zach Neese is talking about what the tabernacle in the Old Testament was all about, and does it have any sort of bearing on us as worshipers in the New Testament? You know, a lot of times we as New Testament worshipers, we have a tendency to look back on the things that happened in the Old Testament and put like a wall of division between who we are now and what worship looked like then and what worship looks like now. And I think we really embrace more of a free type of worship where we see it like unshackled from any of the religious traditions. And a lot of us, who came out of religious traditions, like that unshackling. We like to be released from what we were sort of tied down with in the past. So he's talked about a bunch of different things, but I'm going to just run through some of these questions. Ask some of the questions, and then we can talk about them. Let's just jump into the first question here. He said, the only way to beat Israel was to get God out of the camp. So he's talking about the enemies of God that were surrounding the Israelites. And he said, they couldn't beat Israel because they had to beat God. So the only way that they could beat Israel was to get God out of the camp. It's almost like if you got a big brother or something like that, or a friend who's huge, and there's a bully kid that wants to pick on you. The only way he can do it is if he gets you alone. He's got to be away from your brother or away from, that big friend of yours. And with the enemies of God, they had to get Israel out of the camp. And he says this: the only way to do that was corrupt their worship. And I think he's talking specifically about the golden calf, and when the golden calf happened. That whole thing where God was like, I'm going to kill these people myself, So that's just
time they were drawn away by different, different cultures to worship other gods,
right? Which
on many cases,
really is a picture of us. When we feel like we're removed from, we say, I would never, make a golden calf, but we make golden calves all the time. We walk away from God all the time,
they
and
just
all
look
kinds of different things. Yeah, they're not made of gold and they're not calves, but they're definitely the same thing. So this is what the enemies of God did. And this is what the enemy of our God is doing today. Quote, so how do you think the enemy is corrupting worship today to keep people from accessing God's presence? So in the church, what sort of corruptions do we see? What sort of things do we see that maybe lead people more away from God than towards God? And what sort of things, a lot of times what would be called idolatry in the Old Testament, we could probably see in our own lives, and in the New Testament worship in our churches. We can see all kinds of things that people will make into gods. What kind of things do you guys see that, have that potential to become little mini gods where people are worshiping the wrong thing? It's a redirect of what our affections and our loves really should be.
One of those things for sure is the gifts of those who are leading. Many people worship and respond to the gifts of the people who are leading. And I'm not saying that we can't appreciate the gifts. However, we think people are more anointed because they're more gifted, and it doesn't really speak to the anointing of God or who God has ordained to do whatever it was he has ordained to do. People were gifted, and those gifts were meant to bring God glory. But when those gifts end at them, it becomes an idol situation, whether it's through other people's eyes, through them. And our job as the gifted people, yourself, Dan, Chris, and myself, here being on stage, gifted, is making sure people see God through us more than our gifts. And the hope is, that's why when I try and talk to people, I try to remind them the purpose of what it is we're doing, more than them constantly praising, oh man, I love when you're on stage. Like, I'm constantly saying hi to people, and they're very encouraging, and I greatly appreciate it. But at the same time, when they say, man, I love when you're on stage, I love when you're singing, da-da-da-da, and I say simply to them, I was like, man, just make sure you sing with me, make sure. And oftentimes they'll return with, but I don't sound like you, or you don't want to hear me sing. I was like, it is not about the sound at all. It is about making a joyful noise. It is the position of the heart, the posture of the heart towards God that matters in whatever you do. And so realize that it's not the sound that means anything. It's just your posture of your heart in the things that you submit to the Lord. So,
and it's funny, I think we have to remember that as worship leaders
Yes,
too,
sir.
because we end up getting broken. When people can idolize us for gifts that we have, man, it causes all kinds of disastrous situations. And we can all tell stories about people who are extremely gifted in the church and really broken. They got really messed up because they started, buying their own press type of thing. I remember a story that one of the pastors here was talking about. He was at a university, and they brought in a big Christian artist at the time, a guy who was well known at the time. This is maybe 20 years ago or something like that. And anyhow, this guy was really difficult to deal with. This pastor was going to pick him up, bring him to lunch, and bring him to the venue, just out of the kindness of his heart. He wasn't assigned for it or anything. He just said, yeah, I can help out if you need, help. And he went and did it. And the guy was really, first of all, he didn't like his car. He said, are you actually going to drive me in this? Something to that effect, And then he was unhappy with the food that, the restaurant that he chose or whatever it was, And then they went to the venue, and he got up on stage. And I remember this part distinctly. He looked, and he said, that's a black piano. And the pastor said, yeah, that's a black piano. It was a Steinway or something like that, a good piano, And he said, I specifically said a white piano, and I am not playing unless you get a white piano.
Wow.
And this guy was just, he didn't have anything to do with any of that, and he was caught in the crossfire. But you can see how people can get so self-absorbed and forget that it is not about us, it's about Christ. And, so we as worship leaders, we could have that disastrous outcome if we start thinking that worship is about us and it's about our skills. Because, ultimately, where'd our skills come from, right? Yeah. I mean, they're a gift. God can revoke that gift anytime he wants. It's what he's given to us. So, we have to have great care in that, I think.
And I think that's the tough thing to discern is like we look at the amount of hours, the amount of time that we put into preparation to honing the gifts that we've been given as like, okay, our reward is that we should be told you sound awesome, and that it was our doing because we put in all these hours. But when you look at it, you also have to break down the idea that you put in these hours, but you were also put in graciously by God, put in a position or put in a family or put in a culture that was pushing you to pursue these things, that was pushing you to grow these gifts, or allowing it.
What if you were born in Haiti?
Sure.
You might be subsistence farming, and you'd never know that you
and
had a
that
great
was completely
voice,
out of your control. And that in and of itself is like a recognition of the fact that this gift, part of it comes from you developing it, but you are gifted in so many other ways, not just by the voice that you have, but by the surrounding but by your surroundings. And I know for me, I try to every single time I'm trying to make a habit out of it before leading worship to understand the responsibility that's been given to all of us when we step on that stage to make sure that our only focus, and it's a tough thing, but to make sure our only focus is to direct people towards the Lord and to lead them into God's presence, because it's easy whenever you're on a stage and you're even just physically a little bit higher than the congregation, that can easily start to create this mindset of like, I am greater than, and it's like, no, everyone in that room, we are all worship leaders.
Right.
We've been given a responsibility, though, to make sure that people understand that and are pointed towards the giver of these gifts that we're all, talking about and whatnot.
And, I think the key distinction on that is the distinction between ownership and stewardship. And that's a really key thing that Christians should understand, but most of the time we don't in our lives. We've been given these things to steward them. We're to steward our gifts, which means it's almost like we're a manager of somebody else's stuff. So if you get hired, let's say somebody owned a ranch or a farm or something like that, and you were hired as a steward for that place, you're hired to upkeep, maintain it, develop it, make it profitable, do those things. But you never have the thought that this is mine, I own this. You know that you're really trying to please the owner. And really, anything that we've been given as gifts, that was given by the owner for stewardship that we're supposed to develop. It's not like we own it. And that's all parts of our life, not just our gifting. I mean, it's our kids, and it's our house, and it's our...
Everything is leased.
Right. We really don't own it. It's on a short-term loan.
Anyone who's hearing that like me, he's saying steward, not stored. Steward.
Steward, yes.
This is the way you're saying. I was like, it
Stored.
sounds like he's saying stored for some reason.
Oh, stored.
Yeah.
Stored, yeah, it's steward.
It had a more of an OR sound.
Steward.
I was like,
The
it
stupid
sounds
thought
like
that
stored.
popped in my head was Stuart from that movie, the Mouse movie.
Oh, yeah.
Stuart Little.
Yeah.
When you said Stuart, I just thought of the mouse. I don't know why.
My wife, incidentally, is terrified of mice, and she saw that movie, and I said, "How did you do?" And she said, "I was a little bit afraid, but he was cute." All right, on page 48, he says, question number 4, there's a reason God calls his people sheep and not cattle. I don't know that that's the greatest compliment for us either. You drive cattle, but you lead sheep. And one thing as we unfold this question, he's going to talk about us leading sheep, but we also have to remember we're sheep leading sheep. So just, not to get big-headed about it like we're the shepherd. Jesus is the shepherd. Think about the story of how the worship leader who gave that crowd a royal tongue lashing. So he talked about, in here, he was in some sort of setting, and the crowd wasn't responding the way that the worship leader wanted them to. And they probably legitimately felt like they were disengaged from worship, and they were trying to encourage people to engage in worship. But what they ended up doing is giving them like a browbeating or a tongue lashing, where they sort of belittled them and demeaned them into, like, we're here worshiping the King of Kings. You should be lifting your hands and singing out, which, some of that encouragement can be legitimate, but it felt really demeaning to people. And he said they did it, but in a grudging way. You could tell that there was like this tension in the room, this palpable tension. So as a worshiper, have you ever been treated like cattle? So if you were out in the congregation, and did it empower you to worship? And as a worship leader, have you tried to drive a congregation instead of lead them? And did it help them in worship? David, I know you have a couple stories about being driven like cattle in congregations, and you've experienced some different things too, where you've been really led into higher worship, where it's pulled you along, and you've gone places where you wouldn't have gone without those promptings and encouragement. What's the distinction and what's the difference? How do we divide those? And as a worship leader, how do we see how to lead people and not drive them? It's not a cattle prod, but it's it's the carrot, not the whip.
I like that. It speaks to the previous question that we already answered. It really does, in the sense that we're talking about making ourselves and the gifts that we have and not letting it get to our heads. I think people who tend to browbeat they may understand it and knowledge how awesome God is, but they also want a response from the people. And they tend to, when it becomes more of an abusive thing, then I have a feeling that it's more about you than it is about God. Whereas
That's exactly what I just wrote down here in the book too. Is the browbeating because they want people to give praise to God, or is it because they feel awkward on stage and they want someone to acknowledge that they're there and to make them more comfortable?
Yeah.
Because maybe people aren't responding the way that leader wants them to respond.
Yeah, and that never goes in the right direction. Like I saw a comedian not too long ago at on stage, and things weren't going well, and he was like trying to force the comedy and force people to laugh, and it just went the opposite
Really
direction.
bad, yeah.
When he started doing that, you've lost the room when that happens.
Yeah, it's such a battle, because there needs to be some point of engagement, but how do you toe the line of the truth of who God is, while still expressing the grace, love, and the freedom that is given us, and then encourage the people in the way that draws them into what I like to call the turning on of a light moment, the moment where they are reminded of God's goodness and reminded of who God is in their own lives, and then acknowledge that and respond. I think that's what we've been trying to be intentional about lately as worship leaders. Find moments to allow people to be present, because I think some of a lot of the disengagement of the people can be that their minds are just everywhere but where you are as it relates to service. You're in service, and a lot of people come to service almost as, when you've talked about this before, as kind of the check off the box for the week. And they don't see it as a whole lot more than that. Like, God, I did my thing for you this week. We should be cool. Whereas It's taking the moment to say, hey, this is more than that. There's value in this moment. If you actually just pay attention to who God is and what God has done for you and how he's been in your life, not even just in all the beautiful things, but in the tough moments, you pay attention to those things. And the moments that you've already made it through, look back at it and see how God has matured, blessed, grown you from those experiences. And then acknowledge how good God has truly been, from the beautiful things to some of the most painful things in your life. And you still see the goodness of God in all of it. Then, now let's sing the song. What does the song really mean at that point? And finding a way to get them to acknowledge God in their own lives and then respond from that place, I think is one of the most effective things a lead worshiper, worship leader, lead sheep, whatever we want to call them, the way to encourage people to do that, to own it themselves, I think brings value to the moment, because it helps them to realize, like, hey, it's not about me up here. It's about your connection with Christ. It's about the relationship God has placed in you. I'm just the person reminding you, encouraging you, providing space, atmosphere, sound, and opportunity for you to engage. The hope is I do nothing to impede that, and I think the ones who browbeat have a tendency to impede it, because now it's about, it becomes a battle, not an encouraging, or you're not setting the table. You've created a wall and you're the wall, whereas you want to set the table and remind them of the beauty of God and who he is to them individually, because every person has a different experience with God, while yet the same experience, because of the grace is the same, the love is the same, the mercy is the same, who God is the same, but your individual experience is different. And so to help them be reminded of that and then respond from what they know God has done, I think is a very effective tool. And it's the difference for me as a worship leader and as a sheep when I'm being led, to be reminded of who God is. When somebody says something that strikes my heart in a way that reminds me of who God is to me, that's the most effective thing for me in responding in worship. I mean, I've been in church for a while, so I'm a little more mature, so I've decided in my own self that I was like, no matter what the situation is, I'm going to make it a point to do my best to try and engage God in worship when the opportunity is provided, when the space is provided, when the atmosphere is provided. But when someone speaks to my heart, and it helps me to remember God in a way real in my life, it affects me very differently and in a way more real way. And so we try to do that here as often as we can.
And I had a reminder moment, I guess, a couple weeks ago when I was leading one of the songs, and I looked out, and at that point in the service, during the worship song praise, the whole service is worship, but during the song section of the service, everyone's standing, worshiping, and then I saw someone sit down and almost go put their head down, and they were you could tell they were praying or truly just using that opportunity to reflect. And it was a reminder for myself that when we stand together and we sing songs, it doesn't always look the same for every single person, and it doesn't have to be uniformed. It just needs to be worship. And I also am wondering too, which I think a lot of churches do this, not just us, but you come in, you start with your songs, then you go to the message, and everything is very structured. I wonder if we just one weekend threw people off and we Kurt went into the message first, and then we ended with 3 songs, or we put it right in the middle, which we do sometimes with our message and music service or whatever. But it's, again, just serves as another reminder that there doesn't need to be this finite structure to every single service. At the end of the day, every part of the service is worship. So if you're standing, if you're sitting, if you're listening, if you're singing, it all should be with a heart of worship to God. And that's, even for myself, sometimes I have to catch during the message if I'm zoning out or something, or if I'm not as focused as I need to be or should be because I'm thinking about what's for lunch later. What are we doing after this to go to the grocery store?
Or even your tasks that you do on stage. I know I have a YouTube channel, and I released a video that said what worship guitar players really think about when they're playing, which is kind of funny. But, really, you're thinking about a million different things, because you're thinking about, where your stage lights are. Am I in the heat of the lights, or am I out of the heat of the lights? what the angles of cameras are so that they have like nice shots for you or something like that. What the next words that you're supposed to sing are. Where's my harmony part? I've got to make this transition, and I've got to go from a capo, get the capo off, tune my guitar, pick up my slides, switch my patch on my pedal board, then in the chorus switch to a different patch. So there's this like complication of a lot of things that we're thinking about that are functional things you have to give thought to. And you're up on stage, everybody's looking at you, and you have to do it in a way that looks very, natural
Fluid
and like you're
and,
not
yeah.
really thinking about stuff, but you really are thinking about a lot of different things. And to be able to engage in worship in that time is a really hugely important thing if we are sheep who are the lead sheep, who are trying to lead the rest of the sheep into an experience of worship. And I think, people out there, it's the same thing. They're thinking about all kinds of things, and they're coming to church with all kinds of baggage from the past or from their drives to church even, and to be able to get them to engage and be present in actual worship. And I think, what Zach was talking about here is somebody who is a worship leader who didn't see what they wanted to see. And maybe that spoke to them like, I'm not doing my job properly, or they're not responding to me or something.
Like it's a reflection of their
so yourself can get into those things.
something.
And maybe it wasn't. Maybe they legitimately really just wanted to help people engage, but they did it in a way that was manipulative rather than engaging. But, when I was thinking about that, I thought, from the beginning, God gave us free will. He gave us the ability to obey him, to choose him, or to not choose him. And in order to have true love, you have to have that. So from the very beginning, that's what he wanted, was a heart that came freely and giving fully of their heart. But, he could have made us automatons if he wanted. He could have made little robots who would just always perfectly obey and perfectly worship, but there wouldn't have been any real love in that. But he wants us to come with our hearts and really fully engage. And I think as we remember that that's the ultimate goal of what worship is and worship leading is, that'll really help us to be able to lead our folks in a way that's really engaging and helps them to really engage the heart of God.
Hey, it's Chris. Thanks so much for listening to episode 5 of Walking in Worship. Join us next time as we continue our conversation on chapter 3 of Zach Neese's book, How to Worship a King, and continue walking with us towards a deeper understanding of what worship truly is.